All right, let's dive in. Today we're tackling convention. It seems like a simple word, but for those of us who spent some time thinking about philosophy, we know there's a lot more to it.
Yeah, it's one of those concepts that pops up everywhere, right? You've got the Republican National Convention, the Geneva Conventions, but then there's also like conventional wisdom. So clearly it's doing a lot of work.
Exactly, and it's that kind of slipperiness that makes it philosophically interesting, right?
Absolutely. It's not just a matter of, oh, that's the usual way of doing things. There are deeper questions about how these conventions come to be, what their relationship is to truth, to reality, all that good stuff.
Right, and that's exactly what we're going to explore today. We're using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on convention as our guide.
Which is a pretty dense entry, by the way. I mean, it's thorough, which is great, but it
Okay.
shows you how much there is to say about this seemingly simple idea.
Yeah, no kidding. So our mission for today is to really unpack this concept, to go beyond those everyday examples and see what's at stake philosophically. Um, where do we even begin with something like this? What's the first puzzle that jumps out at you?
Well, for me, and this is something Nelson Goodman pointed out too, it's the ambiguity of the term itself. Like when we say conventional medicine, we often just mean what's typical or standard, but then you have things like conventions in language where it's clearly about rules we've created, not just what happens to be common.
Right, it's like the word straddles this line between what just is and what we've sort of made up or agreed upon.
Yeah, exactly. And for philosophy, it's that made up part that's really intriguing, the fact that conventions are, as the entry puts it, up to us.
Okay, so let's dig into that. The classic example, of course, is social convention. We all do lots of things regularly, like, we eat, we sleep, but that doesn't make those things conventions. So what makes something like, say, driving on the right side of the road a social convention? What's the philosophical distinction there?
I think what's interesting here is the fact that social conventions, these regularities that we all follow, they seem to have this power to create facts. Like, think about money. The fact that a dollar bill is worth something isn't a fact about the paper itself, right?
No, definitely not. It's something we've collectively decided, or at least it's emerged somehow through our interactions.
Exactly. And this was something philosophers like Aristotle and later Hume were very interested in. Money, language, these are things that exist because of convention. Their value, their meaning, it's not inherent in the objects themselves.
So then the question becomes, how do these conventions arise? The simple answer might be, well, we all just agreed, right? Like a contract.
Right, and that's where you get ideas like the social contract, which, Hobbes and others have explored. But if you think about it, even a contract presupposes certain conventions. Like, we have to agree on what a signature means, what constitutes consent, all those things.
And even if you try to go the route of tacit agreements, where it's like we've implicitly agreed even without explicitly saying so, that still doesn't quite work for something as fundamental as language.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, Bertrand Russell had that great line about how it's hard to imagine a bunch of pre-linguistic humans gathering to decide what sounds will represent what objects. It's like, how would they even do that without already having some form of language?
Exactly. And this gets to Quine's really important question. What is convention when there can be no thought of convening?
Right. How do these conventions emerge without us actually sitting down and hashing them out? That's a huge question for anyone interested in the philosophy of language, philosophy of social science, really anywhere that conventions play a role.
So if convention isn't just about explicit agreement, where do we go from there? And this is where the idea of conventionalism comes in, right? This broader doctrine about things being up to us, even things we might assume are natural or objective.
Exactly. Conventionalism pops up all over philosophy. You see it in discussions of property, justice, morality, geometry, even our basic understanding of what exists, our ontology.
Wow, so it really cuts across all these different areas. And what's the core idea? Like, what's the key thesis that would interest a philosopher?
I think the core idea is that for a lot of things, there are multiple equally valid conventions we could have adopted. It's not like the world dictates one specific way of doing things. We have choices.
So it's not just that we happen to do things a certain way, it's that we could have done them differently and it would have been just as good.
Exactly. And a great example of this is Poincaré's work on geometry. He argued that the axioms of geometry aren't like these eternal truths about the universe. They're more like disguised definitions.
So choosing between Euclidean and non-Euclidean geometry, it's not about which one is true in some absolute sense, but maybe more about which one is more convenient or useful for a particular purpose.
Right. And that choice, that's where convention comes in. And this applies to language too. with what's sometimes called linguistic conventionalism. The idea is that the meaning of words, how we use them, it's all a matter of convention.
Like we could have decided to call cats dogs and dogs cats, and it wouldn't have changed anything about the animals themselves.
Exactly. And Carnap took this even further. He had this idea of choosing entire linguistic frameworks, and these choices would then impact not only our logic and mathematics, but also what we believe exists.
Whoa, so our very ontology would depend on these linguistic conventions. That's a pretty radical thought.
It is. And for Carnap, the basis for choosing between these frameworks wasn't objective truth, but things like simplicity and practicality.
So just to be clear, are we talking about two different kinds of convention here? On the one hand, you have Hume, who's looking at existing social practices, how they've emerged over time. And on the other hand, you have Poincaré and Carnap, who are talking about this more deliberate act of stipulation. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's a good distinction to make. Hume is trying to describe the conventions we already have, while Carnap is almost advocating for the creation of new conventions.
Right. Okay. And it's important to remember that conventional doesn't mean arbitrary in a bad way. It just means that it's not predetermined, that we have choices.
Exactly. And those choices can have real consequences, right? Like the convention of driving on the right side of the road, that's not arbitrary in the sense of being meaningless. It has a very clear purpose to prevent accidents.
Okay, so we've got this basic understanding of convention, the idea that things are up to us. But then there's this other idea, truth by convention, which was very popular among the logical positivists. Can you explain that to someone with a philosophical background?
Sure. So the logical positivists, they were trying to figure out how to reconcile their empiricist views with the apparent certainty of logic and mathematics. They didn't want to go the Kantian route and say these truths are synthetic a priori. So they proposed this idea that these truths are actually analytic, true by virtue of the meanings of the terms involved, which are ultimately grounded in linguistic conventions.
Right, like the classic example, a bachelor is an unmarried man. That's true simply because of how we've defined the word bachelor, and they wanted to apply this same logic to things like the laws of logic.
Exactly. But this idea, as influential as it was, ran into some serious problems, most notably from Quine.
Right, Quine's critique of truth by convention is pretty famous. What were his main arguments?
Well, one of the big ones was this problem of regress. He pointed out that we can't just stipulate everything. To derive the vast body of logical truths from a few initial conventions, we need rules of inference. But those rules of inference are themselves part of logic. So it's like we're using logic to explain logic.
That's a great point. It's like trying to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. You need something to stand on.
Right. And even if you try to get around this by stipulating the inference rules as conventions, Quine would say, well, okay, but how do you know those rules are truth-preserving? You need some further justification, and that justification will likely involve more logic and so on.
So it's just pushing the problem back further and further.
Exactly. And Quine had other arguments too, like he questioned whether appealing to convention actually adds anything to our understanding of certain truths. Take the law of identity, that everything is identical to itself. Why say that's true because of a linguistic convention rather than just because that's how the world is?
Yeah, it's like what explanatory work is the appeal to convention doing in those cases?
Right. And he also pointed out that even in science, where we might think some definitions are purely conventional, those definitions can change as our theories evolve. Like the definition of kinetic energy in Newtonian physics turned out to be not quite right according to Einstein's theory.
Okay, so Quine's critique really shook things up. It made people a lot more wary of using convention to explain things like logic and the nature of reality.
Definitely. It doesn't mean conventionalism completely disappeared, but it definitely forced philosophers to be more careful and nuanced in how they use the idea.
Right. So let's return to social conventions now. We talked about how these seem to have the power to create facts, like the value of money. Hume was very interested in this, right? What were the key insights he offered?
Well, Hume's account of convention is actually pretty simple and elegant. He says it all boils down to a shared sense of common interest. Individuals recognize that it's in their best interest to follow certain rules, as long as everyone else does the same.
And this doesn't require some explicit agreement or contract. It's more like a spontaneous coordination that emerges from everyone pursuing their own self-interest.
Yeah, his famous example is the two rowers in a boat. They naturally coordinate their rowing without needing to discuss it or sign a contract.
Right. That's a perfect illustration. And Hume applied this idea to all sorts of social institutions, like
Mhm.
property, justice, and government.
Exactly. He saw convention as this fundamental mechanism for social order, arising from individual rationality rather than some top-down imposition of rules.
So it's like, in a way, Adam Smith's invisible hand, but for social norms.
I like that analogy. And then, of course, David Lewis came along and gave us this much more rigorous, formalized account of convention, drawing on game theory.
Right, and a lot of his work focuses on what he calls coordination problems. Can you explain that concept?
Sure. So a coordination problem is a situation where there are multiple ways for people to act that would be mutually beneficial, but they need to coordinate their actions to actually achieve that benefit.
Like the classic example is two people trying to meet at a restaurant. They both prefer meeting to not meeting, but they have to choose the same restaurant.
Exactly. And there's no inherent reason why one restaurant is better than the other. What matters is that they both choose the same one.
And this applies to all sorts of things in real life, right? Like deciding which side of the road to drive on, what language to speak, even something as simple as how to greet someone.
Right. All these cases where what matters most is that we're on the same page, not necessarily what that page says.
So how does Lewis define convention within this framework?
He says it's basically an arbitrary, self-perpetuating solution to a recurring coordination problem. It's arbitrary in the sense that there might be other equally good solutions, but once a particular convention is established, it tends to stick around because no one has a reason to deviate from it.
And this is where that idea of common knowledge comes in, right? Everyone knows the convention, everyone knows that everyone else knows it, and so on.
Exactly. Common knowledge is crucial for conventions to work because it creates these shared expectations that allow us to coordinate our actions. And Lewis really formalized this idea, making it central to his analysis.
So Lewis's work was hugely influential, but as with most philosophical theories, it also sparked a lot of debate and criticism. What were some of the main objections raised against his account of convention?
Well, one issue is that his definition seems to require almost perfect conformity. But in reality, people violate conventions all the time. Like there's a convention about sending thank you notes, but not everyone always does it.
So the objection is that real-life conventions are often more flexible than Lewis's model allows.
Right. Another concern is that Lewis doesn't seem to capture the normative aspect of conventions. Conventions don't just describe how people actually behave, they also tell us how we should behave.
Like there's a convention about not interrupting people when they're talking, and violating that convention feels like you've done something wrong, not just something different.
Exactly. And the fact that we often sanction people who violate conventions, even if it's just a look of disapproval, suggests that there's more to it than just self-interested coordination.
And Lewis did try to address this, arguing that conventions often evolve into norms, but some philosophers felt that this wasn't enough.
Right. They argued that normativity needs to be built into the very definition of convention, not just something that emerges later on.
Another interesting criticism is about the requirement for alternative conventions. Some people argued that there are cases where there's really only one good solution to a coordination problem, even if it's technically possible to imagine other solutions.
Right. And then there's the question of whether people need to be consciously aware of these alternative conventions for something to count as a convention. Tyler Burge had this interesting thought experiment about an isolated society with only one language.
So they might not even realize that other languages are possible, but their linguistic practices would still seem conventional in the sense that they could have been different.
Exactly. And there's also the question of whether conventionality is a matter of degree rather than a sharp either distinction. Maybe some things are more conventional than others, depending on factors like how arbitrary the solution is.
Right. And of course, since Lewis's framework is grounded in game theory, there have been debates about whether other game theoretic concepts might be more suitable for understanding certain types of conventions.
Absolutely. Like, Sugden has argued that conventions are better understood as evolutionarily stable strategies. And the concept of correlated equilibrium has also been used to model some types of conventions.
And some people have even questioned whether all conventions are really about solving coordination problems in Lewis's sense. Like, what about fashion trends? It's not clear that they're coordinating our actions in the same way that driving on the right side of the road does.
Yeah, that's a good example. And there are other cases too, like conventions governing property rights or practices of reciprocity. Those seem to be doing something more than just helping us coordinate.
Okay, so let's say we accept that many conventions are solutions to coordination problems. How do we explain how we actually converge on a particular convention? How do we choose between multiple equally good solutions? This is what's often called the problem of equilibrium selection, right?
Exactly. If it's rational to follow a convention only if everyone else is following it, how do we get that initial shared expectation? It's a kind of chicken and egg problem.
Right. So what are some of the approaches philosophers and game theorists have taken to this problem?
Well, one approach is to try to find some way for people to rationally deduce the best solution. But as we saw with the restaurant example, sometimes there just isn't a purely rational way to choose.
So we need something more than just logic.
Yeah.
And this is where the idea of salience comes in, right? The thought is that some solutions just stand out as more obvious or natural.
Exactly. Lewis drew on Schelling's work here, who had this famous example about where to meet a stranger in New York City if you haven't made any prior arrangements.
And most people would say Grand Central Station, right?
Yeah.
Just a natural focal point.
Exactly. So Lewis argued that salience plays a big role in equilibrium selection. It helps us coordinate initially, and once a convention is established, its familiarity makes it even more salient.
But salience can be a bit of a slippery concept, right? What's salient to one person might not be salient to another. And it can be hard to formalize.
Yeah, that's true. But even if it's hard to define precisely, many people think it plays an important role.
Okay, and then there are these dynamical models which look at how conventions might evolve over time through repeated interactions.
Right. These models often use tools from evolutionary game theory, where the idea is that certain strategies become more prevalent because they're more successful. Skirms has done a lot of work in this area, showing how signaling conventions can emerge through this kind of evolutionary process.
But of course, there are debates about how well these biological models apply to human behavior.
Definitely. And there are other models, too, like learning-based models, where people adjust their strategies based on what they've observed in the past. But even those models have their limitations.
Right. It seems like equilibrium selection is a really complex issue with no easy answers.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. It's a very active area of research with lots of different perspectives and approaches.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground with Lewis's game theoretic account. But the Stanford entry also highlights some alternative treatments of convention that go beyond that framework. Let's start with Margaret Gilbert's work. How does her approach differ from Lewis's?
Gilbert takes a much more sociological approach. Her key concept is the plural subject, the idea that individuals can come together to form a collective entity with shared commitments.
So it's not just about individuals coordinating their actions. It's about this sense of we, this shared intentionality.
Exactly. For Gilbert, a convention is a jointly accepted principle of action. It's something we do together as a group.
And this built-in normativity, right? It's not just a description of how we behave. It's about how we should behave as members of this plural subject.
Right. Normativity is baked into the very concept of convention for Gilbert, whereas for Lewis, it's more of a consequence that can arise later on.
Okay, and then there's Seamus Miller, who focuses on collective ends.
Yeah, Miller tries to strike a kind of middle ground. He's still interested in rational individuals, but he argues that conventions are often tied to these collective goals that we're all trying to achieve together.
Like the convention of driving on the right side of the road, the collective end is to avoid collisions.
Exactly. But of course, there are debates about whether all conventions can be neatly explained in terms of these collective ends.
And then there's Ruth Millikan, who takes more biological perspective.
Right. Millikan sees conventions primarily as patterns of behavior that are reproduced because of precedent, not necessarily because of rationality or shared intentions.
So it's like we shake hands a certain way just because that's how it's always been done. If history had been different, we might be doing something else.
Exactly. And she downplays the role of conscious deliberation in this process. It's more about unreflective conformity to what's already established.
Wow, so we've got all these different perspectives on social convention. It's a really rich and complex topic. Now let's shift gears and talk about conventions of language specifically. What are the main issues that philosophers are grappling with in this area?
Well, the starting point is that most philosophers agree that the relationship between words and what they represent is largely arbitrary. Like, there's no inherent reason why we call cats cats. It's just a convention.
Right. But the bigger debate is about whether social convention is really the key to understanding how language works, how it gets its meaning.
Exactly. And one of the most influential figures here is David Lewis, who applied his game theoretic framework to language. He focused on what he called signaling problems, where we're trying to use language to convey information and coordinate our actions.
Like that example with Paul Revere and the lanterns in the Old North Church, they needed a prearranged convention to know what the different signals meant.
Right. But of course, natural language is much more complex than that. We're not always trying to elicit specific actions with our words. Sometimes we just want to share information or express our thoughts.
So Lewis later revised his theory to account for this, arguing that language involves conventions not just about actions, but also about beliefs.
Yeah, and he said that a language is basically a function that assigns truth conditions to sentences. And the actual language we use is one where there's a convention of truthfulness and trust, where we expect each other to be sincere and to believe what we say.
And this seems to connect with Grice's theory of speaker meaning, where the meaning of an utterance is tied to the speaker's intentions and the listener's recognition of those intentions.
Exactly. And some philosophers have developed what are called neo-Gracian accounts of meaning, which try to combine Lewisian conventions with Grace's insights.
So the basic idea is that the meanings of words and sentences are ultimately grounded in these shared conventions about how we use language.
Right. But as you can imagine, there are also a lot of objections to these conventionalist theories of meaning.
Like what?
Well, one problem is that it's not clear that we really do always follow a convention of truthfulness and trust. People lie all the time, and we often don't take everything we hear at face value.
So the empirical evidence doesn't seem to fully support that claim.
Right. Another big issue is the productivity of language. We can understand and generate an infinite number of sentences, even ones we've never heard before. How can convention explain that?
It seems like it would be impossible to have a separate convention for every possible sentence.
Exactly. And this suggests that meaning must be somehow compositional, that the meaning of a sentence is built up from the meanings of its parts and the way they're combined.
Right, which raises further questions about how the meanings of words themselves are established by convention.
Exactly. And then you have figures like Chomsky and Davidson who argue that convention isn't really fundamental to language at all.
What do they say?
Well, Chomsky sees language as this internal grammatical system, an idiolect that's not necessarily tied to social interaction. And Davidson argues that we can understand language even without pre-existing conventions through a process of radical interpretation.
So for them, conventions might play some role, but they're not the primary source of meaning.
Right. And then there's this more philosophical objection that maybe the conventionalists have things backwards. Maybe language is actually prior to certain kinds of thought, that our ability to think in certain ways depends on our having language.
So it's not that thought gives meaning to language, but that language shapes our thoughts.
Exactly. That's a pretty radical idea, but it's one that some philosophers have defended.
Wow, this has been a really fascinating deep dive. We've gone from everyday examples of conventions to these really deep philosophical questions about truth, reality, and the nature of language.
Yeah, it's amazing how this seemingly simple concept opens up so many avenues of inquiry, and I think it really highlights the interconnectedness of different areas of philosophy.
Absolutely. And I bet this has sparked a lot of new questions for our listeners. If you want to learn more, definitely check out the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on convention. There's a ton of great material there.
Yeah, and you can also explore related entries on things like common knowledge, game theory, and the philosophy of language.
So, to leave you with a final thought, given how pervasive conventions are, how much of what we take to be real, how much of what we believe is actually based on these shared agreements and expectations that are, in a sense, up to us?
Yeah,
Something to ponder.
definitely something to ponder.
All right, that's all for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.